Hi guys, so I thought it would be worth going over some of the details of the form validation. There's nothing new in this really, but I decided we should maybe put it all together in one place just so I can stress some of the important points. So this form validation example here is pretty much the one you already have in the blog. I just added the phone number validation that we did before, but even without all the make happy checksum stuff, it's much simpler, okay? But I want to stress some of the important points when it comes to validating a form. So the first thing is here, now I just put in some values here. Just bear with me. So when we say buy now, sorry, that's something I had there for debugging, it sends off all of the values to a PHP server. Now it's essential that your assignment does that, okay? And the address for that PHP server is in the example on the blog here, where you say, look, form blah 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 blah, method equals get, action equals http://atlantis.cat.ie/displayvalues.php. So you need to send your data to this PHP server. What this PHP server does is actually sends you back what you sent it. It just echoes back everything you already sent it. So we can see that we successfully sensed that we wanted small, that this was the customer name, this was the credit card number, this was the email address, this was the phone number. So if you were sending a pizza, for example, that order for the pizza would have to include all of the toppings. If all of the toppings aren't sent back to you here by the PHP server, then something is wrong. So all of the information that you need to send should be visible here. If something is missing, you need to go back to your form and make sure it's there. The most likely bug is that you need to look at the name property, because the name properties here are what the names are what are used to send the values. For checkboxes, it's easiest if each checkbox has its own individual name. For radio buttons, you will duplicate the name, but that's okay because only one value is going to be sent anyway from a set of radio buttons. There's a slightly more complex way to do it in that you can submit an array of checkboxes as a single in a single value, but I wouldn't recommend doing that unless you already have done it and it's already working, in which case don't touch it. In any event, everything you send must come back to you in this form here, okay? You must see what was sent. You don't need to send the price, incidentally. That wouldn't make sense, because if you were relying on the customer's client side to send you the price, you could order your pizza maybe for, you know, a cent or something. So it would be calculating the price at the other end anyway. So you don't need to send the price, which is handy because the price might not actually be in the form as such. So it could make it complicated. Now, so I want to look at some of the features of this. Okay, we have all of our inputs there, and I have set some of those to required, just by saying required as a property, just like that. That means that if the user doesn't type something in, the form won't send. So if I don't put something in, of course, yeah, it's the same as before, sorry. If I don't put something in for the things I'm supposed to have, it'll say, look, you must fill that in. Now that's a feature of HTML5. It's doing that for me. The browser's doing, that's not coded or anything. The browser's just doing that, it's giving out for me, which is great, because that was, that's less code we have to write. Okay, the browser, in the past you would have had to write code to check that was there. No. There's a very important piece of code up here. When you specify the form, you're saying on submit return validate input semicolon. So when you submit the form, this function gets called, and if this function returns true, then yip-de-doo, everything is fine, the form gets submitted, assuming everything else is okay with it. If this function returns false, then the form won't be sent. So it's really important that this works properly. All I've put into my validate input function is code to validate the phone number. And there's nothing here you haven't seen before. So here we're taking the phone number off the form. Get rid of that now while I'm here. We're taking the phone number off the form, and then we have the familiar setup here where we set valid equals to true by default. If we get some reason to be cross, if we find something's dodgy with the input, so in this case there's nothing there. Here it's not a length of 10. Here it doesn't start with 08. Here we're extracting the third digit, which is the second in JavaScript land. So if it's not a 3, a 5, a 6, a 7, or a 9, there's an issue. And then here we're just checking that each of the characters is a digit and not a letter. We've done all this before, nothing new there. Okay. So this will return false if there's something wrong with the input. So for your validations, you would probably have a single function that checks everything. Now it would probably do that by going to check individual things. So you might call a function that checks the credit card. And if the credit card is good, it'll come back with true. If the credit card is false, if the credit card is bad, it would come back with false. And then it would set the overall validation to be false. Any one dodgy thing is going to make the whole thing dodgy. You don't want to send the form. Okay. This here is nothing we haven't seen before. Here, I took this from the example with the phone numbers. We're setting the background of the input to some background color just to make it give out. And then importantly, we're returning valid here. So this function here will come back then with either true or false. And like I said, if everything else in the form is okay, and this comes back as true, then the form is submitted. It gets sent off. If that comes back false, it won't go. So let's see that in action. Actually, yeah, so we have to have something there. We have to have something there. So this now isn't the validate input function doing anything. This is HTML5 just giving out because I said those are required and there's nothing in there. I need an email address. You notice actually that the validation for the email isn't terribly sophisticated. And I'm going to put in a phone number here now, but I'm going to make it too short. That tells me that I haven't refreshed the page, sorry. And you can see here that it's giving out. So it's changed the color. What's important is not only has it changed the color, but it has stopped the form from being sent off. That was the main thing. Okay, so because validate input came back as false, the form wasn't sent. It won't be sent until I fix that. And so off it goes. Now, I want to show you now something else. So in the assignment, there are marks going for using the HTML5 validation for forms. So I deliberately did that wrong there. So now I am engaging the style sheet that I had applied to this page. And what it's done here is it has styled the required inputs differently. And that's because I said in the CSS, I'll just make that larger there. I said, if you have an input that's required, then style it like this. So this is a pseudo class that you can use with HTML5. It's a great feature, really. And it allows you to style form elements depending on whether they look the way they're supposed to look in terms of the input. So this is, you notice this is a pseudo class, so it's not a dot, it's a colon. So this is saying wherever you have an input that's required, I want it to look like this. Now, this is particularly ugly, and it's not particularly, from a user interface point of view, it's not particularly informative either. What most people do with the CSS is they actually use the CSS to put an asterisk behind things that are required. Usually you see a little asterisk there, or a little star, to tell you something is required. That's what people are used to seeing. But the point is here is that because these fields are required in the form, they're styled differently. Now, I mean, the phone number is also required. If you don't put that phone number in there, it's not going to go anywhere. But in the HTML, I have not said that the phone number is required. So that's why the CSS hasn't done anything. Now, the JavaScript is going to force it to be required because the validate function won't come back true unless there's the right kind of information in there. But because these are required in the HTML, the browser won't send off. The HTML, the browser is going to have a tizzy fit on your behalf and stop it from going. Okay, so the browser is going to enforce that. No. So that is the required pseudo class. What's much more interesting, it's really, really interesting, is that we can also have, sorry, that's a bit big, valid and invalid. So I've said to the browser that this is supposed to be a number. You can see that in the HTML there. These are the new HTML5 types that are quite specific. So here I said the credit card is of type number. So it is required. So if I put something in there, you can see that because, oops, let's see just a second. Because I put something in there, it's happy-ish. No, actually no, because it's a number, I think the CSS is kicked in already, so you can't see that now, but it's expecting a number there, okay? And if I put something in other than a number, it'll be cross. If we just make sure the CSS is saved there and engage that there. This is required and there's nothing in there. Okay, so as soon as I put something in, it'll be happy. So it's still required, which is why the border is thick. But now the input is valid because there's something in there. And so the background color is white and the text color is black. I could do the same here, but it doesn't go white and black. It's still required, so it's still thick border, but it's invalid. The background color is pink and the text is red. And the reason for that is I told the browser that that particular input was a number. So it's not having those letters. It's not acceptable. Only if I put that in the format that it's expecting will it be happy. Here, I can put numbers and letters, but this is an email. So until such a time as I put in the @ and blah, 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 it's not happy. And like I said, I think that's particularly unsophisticated, because I think for this to be a valid email address, you have to have some text, you need an @ you need at least one character, I would say maybe even 2 at least, followed by a dot, followed by at least 2 characters. So it's a bit plain. But the point is here that the style of these inputs has changed in response to my putting in the correct kind of input. If I put in the wrong kind of input, it responds and changes the style again. Okay, so the style of these boxes is going to change depending on what's put in them. What's really interesting and what's really powerful is that it's the CSS is doing that. You don't have to write a single line of JavaScript to make that happen. It's the CSS is doing it. Okay. So if I say, yep, blah, blah, blah. So now I go to buy now. So all of the HTML5 inputs, the browser is happy. But when I say buy now, the validate input function goes and does its thing, and it comes back with false, so it still doesn't get sent. I have to put in something that looks proper. You see, this is going to fail also because 088 isn't good. It has to be 087. So now all of the required inputs have something in there. The numbers have numbers in there. The emails have emails in there. So everything should be happy now to go, and away we go. Interestingly, if I put in, this isn't required, so it's not doing anything. It's expecting a URL. If I put in something that isn't a URL, it gives out. So now even though everything else is okay, this is dodgy, so it still won't go. Just please enter URL. If I say .ie, will that, no. So it needs to start with http://. Now it's happy. This looks the way it does because it's not required, but it must be a URL. So if I can leave it blank, but if I put something in there, I have to put in a proper web address. Okay, so now it should be good to go. Interestingly, you can see I've made a mistake here in that I haven't written the JavaScript that would change this back to good when the number's good. When I changed this, it should have responded by putting this back to white or whatever. Okay. So we send this off, everything goes off, yip-de-doo. Okay, so there we go. So 2 important points there. So what I was trying to make with this little class is that you return a function here. So you call this function here evaluates the true or false. If it comes back false, the form won't be sent. So that's where you do all your user input validation. And then the second important point I was trying to make is that you can use input::required, input::invalid, and input::valid. You can use the required, invalid, and valid pseudo classes to style elements on the page in response to the information that's in them, which is really, really powerful, really, really easy, really, really quick, and no JavaScript required. So people who've been doing this for a while are really, really delighted with all these new features of HTML5. Of course, if you were doing this for the first time, you'd think, well, yeah, why wouldn't it do that? But trust me, this was an awful lot of work in the past just to check if something looked like an email, just to check if something looked like a number. Okay, so I'll leave it there. So good luck with that.